All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on climate policy on the road to COP26. This event is organized by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance in collaboration with the United Kingdom Science and Innovation Network. Thank you for partnering on this with us. And today we'll hear from experts in climate policy and different areas. Just want to introduce myself before starting and talk a little bit about the idea behind this webinar in relation to the issue. So this webinar is meant to inspire authors to submit to the special topics issue around climate change solutions, aligned with the 2021 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, taking place in Glasgow, Scotland from November 1st to 12, 2021. Publications will be reviewed by an expert review committee, and authors from the top 3 papers will be invited to speak at the British Embassy. And I will share the link. You can see a link here, but I will share it in the chat later as well. So in relation to this, today's conversation is focused on ways in which public policies or governance structures could address global climate change in 3 priority areas: adaptation and resilience to climate change, the energy transition phasing out coal power, and nature-based solutions to climate change. We will hear today from experts in the field and provide opportunities for Q&A in the breakout rooms as well. So my name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the Chief Outreach Officer for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, and I will be telling you about JSPG in a little bit. But right now, I would like to introduce Rennet Prower. Rennet is the Director of the UK Government Science and Innovation Network for the Eastern USA. Rennet and her team are tasked with designing and implementing an ambitious strategy to grow and strengthen the bilateral relationship between Great Britain and the United States on research and innovation. She is based in the UK consulate in Cambridge. Before arriving in the US, Rennet served for 3 years as the science attaché to the British ambassador in Tel Aviv, where she established the UK's first science diplomacy projects in the region. Rennet, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's amazing to have more than 50 people here as sort of potential authors and contributors to this special issue. So what I thought I would do is give you a quick introduction to the Science and Innovation Network, or as we're affectionately known in government, the SIN team, or the Sinners. We maintain we have the best 3-letter acronym known to government bureaucracy. So a quick introduction, as it were. The UK government has long been driven by the conviction that science and innovation are the fundamental underpinnings of growth and prosperity. And not only that, but that modern foreign policy is inextricably interwoven with science and tech. So as we all know, kind of more often than not today, scientific issues are at the heart of our bilateral and multilateral interactions. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought that relationship to the fore, but it's long been clear that science is fundamental in numerous areas of our modern diplomatic engagement. I mean, you know, you think about anything sort of from reducing global nuclear risk, agreeing safety standards for international trade, managing transboundary water resources, negotiating security around emerging technologies, combating climate change. Science is really seminal to kind of modern international relations. So the UK was quick to realize this, and in the late 90s, the UK government established what was the first network in the world, a dedicated science resource within its diplomacy apparatus. And hence the Science and Innovation Network was established as part of what was then the Foreign Office and is now the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So now the Science and Innovation Network has over 100 offices. We're in different countries and territories all around the world. And we are tasked with building partnerships and collaborations on science and innovation and supporting the UK's evidence-based policy. So obviously we're delighted to be partnering with JSPG on this special issue. As you can tell, working with young researchers on evidence-based policy to combat climate is exactly the kind of thing that's critical to our mission. So we're really looking forward to your submissions, and thank you all so much for your interest in being part of this. And before I hand back to Adriana, I want to kind of give a huge thanks to Adriana herself and to our center, Hannah Davelman, who is our Senior Science Officer in San Francisco, who has masterminded this webinar and invited me to moderate the fascinating panel, which I'm really looking forward to. So I'll hand back to you, Adriana.
Great, thank you. So let's go back to the slides. So thank you for that introduction. So we'll move on to talk a little bit about JSPG and then move into the panel. We hope that this event today will be informative and inspiring for all of you, as Rennet said, to think about climate issues overall, globally. And we're looking forward to your participation in the breakout rooms as well. Before we start the panel, I would like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and we reserve the rights to share it after the event. You're welcome to ask your questions in the chat window, and then it would be helpful to note if your question is directed for a particular panelist, so you'll be able to do that in the breakout rooms. And we also encourage you to share about the event on social media. So JSPG is on Twitter, SciPol Journal, UKSIN, as well as we're using the Climate Policy Solutions hashtag for this event. So now I'd just like to tell you a little bit about JSPG. So JSPG is an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed publication, as well as a nonprofit, but we really are more than just a journal looking to create a platform for the next generation of STEM and policy leaders and elevate their voices in policy as well as their policy research. Through publishing in JSPG, authors gain credibility in science policy. They can leverage their writing for policy engagement and participate in debates and discourse in science and technology policy. Our mission is to help students and early career scholars of all academic backgrounds bolster their research and writing credentials in science and technology policy. And we encourage them beyond the publication to engage in and contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government, whether that's local, national, or international. And we really are looking to contribute to their professional growth as well by helping them write for a diverse set of audiences. And in addition, promoting their work through our social media, global mailing lists, as well as individual outreach and other channels. So I'll tell you a little bit about this in a second. I want to just show you the breadth of the different formats and topics we publish on. So you can see here, OPEDs, technology assessments, policy memos, etc. Again, we cover every corner of science and technology policy. This includes topics such as artificial intelligence, STEM education and workforce, science communication, the government, university, industry interfaces, just to name a few examples. So feel free to check us out at sciencepolicyjournal.org. And as I mentioned, one of the ways that we want to elevate the voices of early career researchers in policy beyond the publications is through events. And this is my role here as Chief Outreach Officer. So I want to show you just a few things that we've done and that may be also incentives for you to publish in the journal and then participate in some of these events after. So one of the things we've done a webinar with AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships on policy careers, as well as other trainings with UC Irvine, as well as NSPN. You can see our UNMGCY issue published here in Emerging Technologies, which was followed by a webinar as well. And we try to encourage authors to join both virtual events as well as sessions or conferences to really talk about their publications. And we also do this through a podcast called SciPol Soundbites, which I also run and we started a couple of months ago to interview the authors from the issue. And this is, again, hopefully another incentive to publish and then be able to discuss your work on this podcast. So before I turn it over to Rennet, I just want to, since I won't have the opportunity to actually close the session later, I just want to thank again UKSIN for partnering with us and remind you to submit to the special topics issue by January 10, 2021. To keep updated on our issues and events, subscribe to our newsletter, as well as the podcast, SciPol Soundbites for on YouTube and SoundCloud. And then you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal. So I'll stop sharing now and turn it over to Rennet to introduce our panelists.
Okay, hi, it's me again. So we have about 25 minutes. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and while their biographies are astonishingly long and filled with accomplishments, I'm going to keep my introductions really short and ask each of them to give us a bit of a window into their professional world by telling us 2 things that their field of research and study definitely knows, and 2 things that they're working hard to find out. I'll also introduce you to each of the moderators for our breakout rooms who we're delighted to have with us. And then after this opening introductory panel, you will be able to join the breakout room that you've selected for a more in-depth discussion and presentation from each of the researchers that we have with us today. So let's start with our 2 researchers. You'll notice a theme. There's one from the UK and one from the US on each of these breakout sessions. Let's start with the Adaptation and Resilience session. So in this session, we're very lucky to have Dr. Tiffany Troxler, who is the Director for Science for the CLevel Solutions Center in the Institute of Environment at Florida International University. Her research focuses on wetland ecosystems ecology, including work to inform wetland management and restoration in natural environments, as well as adaptation strategies that integrate wetland features in urban environments. She's a co-editor and contributing author on 2 IPCC GHG methodological reports and ASFPM certified floodplain manager. And together with Tiffany, we're lucky to have Dr. Jenny Brown, who is a coastal oceanographer for the UK's National Oceanography Centre. And her expertise is in wave, surge, and tidal modelling, storm impact modelling, and technology development to validate model capability. Her current research is focused on new measurements to support decisions and develop modelling tools and cost-benefit analysis to plan new coastal schemes. And it's great fun to have Tiffany and Jennifer joining together in this session because Miami and Southampton are actually sister cities. So I'm going to hand over first to Tiffany to ask you to tell us 2 things you know and 2 things you're trying to find out.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction, Rennet. So yeah, I'm a wetland ecologist and trying to think more about how we can incorporate those natural or wetland features into the built environment as we build adaptation strategies and work to become more resilient and sustainable at the same time. So what we know is that we need to apply more holistic perspectives and approaches for building resilient adaptation. And we also know that well-managed and well-protected or conserved coastal wetlands can both confer mitigation benefits, adaptation benefits, and other ecosystem services. What we don't know so well is, what is that general, widely accepted approach for valuing social and environmental benefits so that we can better prioritize those aspects as we're building adaptation in our built and natural environments. And we also don't know well as a result of that what the potential for resilient adaptation can be to enhance sustainability, equity, and quality of life for people that live in coastal environments.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And so I'm going to hand over to Jennifer to tell us in your field, what are 2 things we know and 2 things we do not know?
Well, hi everyone, I'm Jenny. So I've come from a background of coastal modelling, but to validate models you need observations. So I've recently moved into collecting new data to validate models. So I know that sea level is rising and this is causing nuisance flooding. So something I don't know is when are we going to have the first smart sea wall and where might that be? And I hope to be involved in something new and exciting like that. The other thing that I do know is our ability to forecast flooding is really improving, and that's going to be important as we move into a world where we have to live with nature and live with more frequent flooding. So the second unknown is, when are we going to have real-time systems that we can plug into our navigation systems so we can actually divert people away from flood hazard as it's happening, so they don't accidentally drive into it. And again, real-time hazard monitoring is something that I'm interested in, so I hope I'll be involved in that when it happens. So thank you.
Thank you. I would certainly like to be diverted from floods as they happen. So thank you to our two researchers in the Adaptation and Resilience panel. You will have the opportunity to join them if that's your selected breakout session to hear a bit more about what they do. And I'm also very happy to have Amy Spall with us, who is going to moderate that session. Amy is the Energy and Environment Policy Advisor at the British Consulate General in Houston, and her portfolio spans a range of UK priorities with a focus on energy and climate issues, in particular delivery of the UK's COP26 objectives ahead of the event next year. So now let's move over to our second theme, and that is the energy transition and phasing out coal power. And in this session, we're really lucky to have with us Dr. Claire Haggett, who is a senior lecturer in sociology of sustainability at the School of Social and Political Science in the University of Edinburgh. And for the last 15 years, she has been researching public responses to on and offshore renewable energy developments, focusing in particular on engagement processes, the assessment of impact and benefits, and community engagement programs. Claire has recently led a series of research projects for the Scottish Government on community engagement and renewables. And she's the author of a number of widely cited publications on these topics. She's conducted research funded by the ESRC, which is our Environmental Sciences Research Council, and the UK Energy Research Centre, as well as the European Union. And with Claire, we're also very pleased to have Dr. Brian Murray, who is the director of the Duke University Energy Initiative. Brian is known for his work on the economics of energy policy, including the design and the assessment of carbon tax, cap and trade, and tradable performance standards, as well as policies affecting the markets for bioenergy and renewables. Claire, can we start with you? In your field, what are two things we know and two things we don't know?
Thanks very much, Rennet, and hello everyone. It's brilliant to be with you all today. What we know, two things. Firstly, we know that communities matter and that we can't envisage a clean energy transition without community support. The second thing we know is that it's vital that there is a fair distribution of the costs and benefits of that clean energy transition. In terms of what we don't know yet, we don't know how to ensure that energy justice is always part of decision-making processes. And we don't know yet whether we're moving quickly enough to bring about the clean energy transition that we so desperately need. But spoiler alert, more on all of that to come in the energy transition stream.
Perfect, thank you, Claire. And can we turn to you, Brian?
Sure, thank you, Rennet. Two things we know. One is in the US, renewables are at or below parity on cost with natural gas and coal generation. And if rapid progress on energy storage continues at pace, we'll be able to scale up renewables and handle the load demands technically and economically, even with electrification by mid-century. Regardless of that, the future for coal is rather bleak in the US. The second thing is that we can get on track to decarbonize the US electric power by mid-century, but the big game strategy has to include other sectors such as transportation, industry, and buildings, and other countries, including those who use very little energy now and want to use more in the future. What we don't know really is how much climate change will affect all this, how it will affect the scale and profile of load demand, and because that will present some technical and economic challenges in terms of supplying, and then how much it will affect the renewable resources and transmission infrastructure for delivery. We've had some problems in the US and the Western United States in particular with wildfires and how that has affected the transmission infrastructure. for electric power. And we don't know whether other decarbonized power sources like green hydrogen, advanced nuclear, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage might dramatically disrupt the market in the next decade. If so, it'll diversify the mid-century mix beyond wind, solar, and hydro, and maybe even take it over. This is not going to be, this is not going to end with one dominant technology. Back to you.
Thank you both so much. And it's fascinating that in the energy transition breakout room, we're going to hear about engagement both with our economic systems and with our social systems. And that is a real challenge, I think, to government and to all of you out there thinking of submitting articles about how these systems actually interact with each other, as well as with the research that's happening in these sectors. I'm really pleased to also introduce you to Cynthia Connor, who will be moderating the energy transition phasing out coal power breakout room. Cynthia is a senior advisor on energy and environment with the Global Economic Policy Group at the British Embassy. She's based in Washington, DC. Cynthia's portfolio spans a range of UK policy priorities, and her focus is on international energy and climate issues. She also leads the team's congressional engagement and engagement with the energy industry. So thank you for moderating, Cynthia. And now let's turn to our final breakout room, nature-based solutions to climate change. And in this breakout room, we're really lucky to have with us Diego Sanchez-Gil, who is a technology entrepreneur on a mission to find ways of mitigating climate change by protecting and restoring nature. Diego co-founded Pachama, a technology company that uses artificial intelligence and satellite data to verify and monitor carbon sequestration by forests in order to drive more funding to their conservation and restoration. Diego, I hope I'm pronouncing the name of the company right, but you'll correct me if I'm not. We're also very lucky to have with us Professor Pete Smith, who is a chair in plant and soil sciences at the University of Aberdeen. His main areas of expertise are in modeling greenhouse gas, carbon mitigation, bioenergy, biological carbon sequestration, and global food systems modeling. Among many other honors, Professor Smith is also a fellow of the Royal Society, as well as the science director of Scotland's Climate Change Centre. So I will hand over to you first, Diego, to tell us 2 things you know and 2 things you don't.
Sure, thank you so much for having me. The first thing I know is that forests can play an enormous role on mitigating and reversing climate change. We have 1 billion hectares available for forest restoration that has a potential of recapturing up to 200 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere, and is one of the most scalable and easy solutions we have. We just have to go and plant a lot of trees, and of course, stop deforesting the standing tropical forests that we have today, providing the service of carbon sequestration. The second thing I know is that there is a lot of interest, both in markets and in governments, to support nature-based solutions. And we just need to build the tools and the science and the technology to assure the integrity of the investments. The things I don't know is whether all these intentions and promises by corporations and governments will materialize. So we have to do everything that's in our hands to make sure that that happens. And you know, I guess I also don't know how fast satellite data and remote sensing technologies will continue to evolve, which we're seeing, you know, big progress, and we continue, you know, having our eyes on what's new there.
Great, thank you, Diego. Did we say the name of the company right? Is it Pachama?
Yeah, that's correct.
Great. And now let's turn to you, Pete.
Okay. As Diego said, we know that nature-based solutions have a really significant global mitigation potential, the order of several gigatons per year. So, and we also know that nature-based solutions can have a significant contribution to addressing our other major challenge, which is biodiversity conservation. So we know those 2 things are in the bag. The things that we don't know so well is all of the co-benefits and trade-offs associated with implementing these different nature-based solutions and the impacts that they have on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we as yet don't have a really clear idea about how vulnerable they are to future climate change. For example, from fires, droughts and such like, because they're not a permanent store of carbon. So we have to know more about the likely feedbacks. And the last thing we don't know is that there are 99 ways of doing something wrong, of implementing it wrong and messing it up, and only one way for every one way of getting it right. And we see interventions in natural systems littered with examples of that all over the world. So I think we need to look a bit more less at science, or beyond science, I should say, to implementation, and what makes a successful implementation of a nature-based solution to co-deliver to the same sustainable development, biodiversity and climate mitigation.
Thank you so much, Pete. I think it's fascinating to hear in the Nature-Based Solutions breakout room discussions about government commitments and the ways in which both academia and the startup sector can work together around what I've heard called reforestation. So I'm really curious to hear about what your discussion covers. Finally, I'm very happy to introduce you all to AlexStapleton, who is going to moderate our Nature-Based Solutions breakout room. Alex is a senior policy advisor for energy and environment at the British Embassy. He's also based in Washington, DC. And Alex oversees the embassy's low carbon energy and green finance portfolios. And he also leads US engagement on climate action at state and federal levels. Alex is also a Clean Energy Leadership Institute fellow. So with that, I will briefly hand back to Adriana to see if there's anything we need to know before we move into our breakout sessions.
Great, thank you for that. Those are really great introductions. Just a couple of remarks. So I will be opening the breakout rooms in a little bit. So you'll hear from our speakers. You can see the schedule. We'll have 2 presentations and then Q&A, but we will not be returning to this room. So once we're done, you can leave from there. I would just like to ask the moderators to remember to record your room as well as take notes in the Google Sheets that we've provided. And we'll go, I will give you about probably 10 and 5-minute warning before closing, and then you can feel free to leave from there. Are there any questions before we split up? Great. If there are any issues, feel free to leave the room and come back here. I'll be in the main room for assistance.
How's that? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, super. So let's, so thanks everyone for being here today. It's great, great having you part of this discussion, and look forward to a fruitful one. My name is Tiffany Troxler, and I'm as Rennet mentioned, I work at Florida International University, and my expertise is in wetland ecology. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that we're trying to realize in terms of informing resilient and sustainable adaptation in South Florida. So just a really quick overview of the CLevel Solutions Center. So we really strive to take an interdisciplinary approach, bringing faculty and external partners together to utilize science-based decision-making, and understanding that building adaptation and addressing sea level rise and other climate change impacts are things that require really working across disciplines, working across silos to move the needle on solutions that we can pursue, and to have a good science framework and foundation for doing that. So we all know we're here today because we know that climate change is one of the, we also know that climate change is one of the greatest sustainability challenges, as it is a resilience challenge. And we know that climate change is no longer considered just an environmental issue. We know that the impacts of climate change permeate every sector of our society, and with significant implications for social equity, economic prosperity, and quality of life for everyone. And so in South Florida, we'll just zoom down into some of the issues that we're grappling with in a very real way every day, or and more pronounced at certain times of the year when we experience the tidal flooding events that Jenny mentioned in her presentation. But we work hard to try to coordinate across our county and municipal governments on planning, utilizing unified projections for sea level rise. And this figure here illustrates sort of a South Florida a set of projections utilizing, what we know is the federal data and localizing that, and producing sea level rise projections that help us to plan in a 50-year horizon, and using this kind of information as a planning tool is intended to also guide planning around what your risk tolerance is. So if you're planning for infrastructure or some that you either want to last for a very long time or is critical or interconnected infrastructure, the guidance is to use a higher projection for sea level rise within this 50-year planning horizon. And then we all understand that the uncertainties of projecting sea level rise, and the farther you go out into the future, the more uncertain it becomes. And so in South Florida, we are experiencing the effects of sea level rise today. We see that in a number of ways in which we've sea level rise interacting with our infrastructure. For example, our water management system is largely gravity-based water management, which means that as the sea level gets higher and varies with over certain times of the year, it's more difficult for our gravity-based water management infrastructure to operate, and then resulting in inland flooding in under some conditions. Some of the ways in which we've managed our parcel wastewater are now intersecting with things like rising groundwater tables. We know that some of our the septic systems that we use in some areas even are not functioning as they should be. And then also influences in the Everglades. We've developed quite a lot of really advancing our understanding of how saltwater intrusion influences both the natural system as well as the provision of water supply now, and getting a better handle on what that looks like into the future. And so this is just a quick shot of one of the areas that we do some research. This is a local community within mainland Miami, very low lying, and during a tidal flooding event a few years ago. So, I don't know how much you've heard on the popular media. We used to hear a lot about Miami Beach, but this is not just a Miami Beach issue for us in South Florida. So what we have come to understand is that the way that we've designed and built our infrastructure systems are not going to work for us into the future. And what we also realize is that as we are planning and strategizing and implementing resilience projects, each one of those investments can bring us simply, flood risk reduction, or could potentially bring us other benefits with comprehensive and holistic planning and breaking through those silos that we talked about, that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So what we know is that traditional approaches to flood risk management are often incompatible with sustainable outcomes, with sustainability of the environment, and often when we use certain types of approaches that present situations where there's a possibility of failure, when that infrastructure fails, people are suffering and scrambling to recover, and therefore often do that in unsustainable ways. So we want to think about how we can move beyond one discipline approaches to be more comprehensive and holistic with the types of adaptation actions that we're taking, and really prioritizing sustainability as part of that. So how can we do that? So we can think more comprehensively, take systems level approaches as we're planning resilience and resilient adaptation projects. Try to integrate across systems. So not just thinking about infrastructure systems, but also the social and environmental systems that can help to minimize the consequences of failure, as an example. Ensuring that we're using data and science to try to forecast and assess what the potential outcomes in social, environmental, and infrastructure domains those types of investments produce, and forging strong community partnerships is a critical aspect of this. And having the intentional goal of enhancing environmental sustainability and social equity as we're planning and implementing projects over time. So I'm a wetland ecologist, as I mentioned, so it's easiest for me to get my head around this from the context of thinking about coastal wetlands and wetland environments and the multiple ecosystem services that can be conferred from well-managed coastal environments. And so thinking about how, when we're making these investments, what are the opportunities for sort of tweaking how we apply those investments to elicit more comprehensive and cross-sectoral benefits. So just thinking about this, just very articulating this in a very visual way, we can regulate water flow with storm water drainage, or we can try to think about that project a little bit differently, and aim and strive to complement those investments with other and elicit other benefits. So, and we understand also that even in national and federal policies and work that's been done over the years, that wetland mitigation as a feature of climate adaptation is being more readily recognized, as well as more readily recognized as an opportunity for enhancing both sustainability and resilience. And so just one example of that, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine undertook a research study to look at carbon removal approaches, and including coastal blue carbon among those. So coastal blue carbon, this is essentially the carbon dioxide that can be removed from the atmosphere in coastal ecosystems, and trying to really dig in on what is the potential, and how can that potential be realized, and what sort of research agenda is necessary to move the needle on this. And understanding, when we compare these types of approaches to engineered approaches, that it can provide a near-term opportunity that is lower cost, in part because of the other ecosystem services that are generated from coastal blue carbon, or these coastal wetland systems that we're creating or restoring, or using it in integrating into our shorelines as we're adapting our coastal environments. So how else are we trying to, bring this to the community level and try to use science and work across disciplines to bring this sort of vision and science-based approach for integrating a more holistic approach into adaptation in South Florida. So there are a number of projects that we're involved in. One, federally funded projects as well as locally funded, and really understanding that the communities and participants in these types of projects where we're working to co-produce knowledge and understand what the give and take is in terms of implementing these kinds of approaches. This work is already being undertaken. It's already being embraced by local communities, and it really is a matter of just trying to get to the point where the planning is hitting the ground, where those opportunities are being implemented. And other ways that we're trying to advance this work is, what sort of carbon sequestration can you get out of restoration projects around Miami, or trying to understand, using experimental studies to understand what the vulnerability of Everglades coastal wetlands are to saltwater intrusion, and what kind of hydrologic management actions do we need to be advancing in order to preserve that carbon, to continue to sequester that carbon, and to continue to provide protection to our water supply. And then other opportunities for engaging with communities as well as students and incorporating this kind of material into learning opportunities. So working closely with community members and developing seminars that cities can promote and really herald the types of work that they're doing to try to improve resilience and quality of life of their residents, doing citizen science work, bringing students and community members together to help us to collect the type of information that we could not be collecting otherwise, given a tidal flooding event that occurs over a domain where 3 million people live. These types of citizen science or crowdsourcing activities can be really helpful, both in terms of generating data that we wouldn't be able to generate otherwise, but also raising community awareness. And then also just working across colleges within the university, getting students or inviting students of different disciplines to work together to think through these issues of resilient and sustainable design. And then I'll just close with this slide that as another opportunity that we're engaging in, and it's trying to push forward a research agenda for measuring resilient outcomes as these strategies are being implemented and as these investments are being made. How are we going to know whether we're meeting our intended outcomes? And so trying to develop a research agenda and a framework for understanding how we're moving the needle with our resilience investments over time, working with partners, both other academic institutions, nonprofits, and our municipal partners. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me release the screen.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. That was very interesting. Just to say, if anyone has any questions, we'll wait and ask them at the end. If you want to pop them into the chat, I'll be sure to look through and ask Tiffany and Jenny any questions you may have. I will now pass it on to Jenny.
Okay, I shall get my slides up. I'll probably turn off my video if that's okay, because I've got a few videos that I'm hoping will screen share. I think if I turn my own video off, it should be better. If the screen sharing doesn't work well with the videos, I will put links to them on YouTube in the chat afterwards. So don't worry if it's a little bit flaky when the videos play. So I'm going to be talking about new sensors to quantify coastal scheme flood resistance and resilience. So when I'm talking about resistance, that's how well concrete performs about holding back floodwater. And then resilience is more about when we're working with nature. Can it grow? Can it keep up with sea level rise? If it gets damaged, can it rebuild and maintain flood protection? So hopefully this video will play. This is the new system that we've recently developed at the National Oceanography Centre that I'm going to be mainly talking about. We had a wave splashing through our system, which we're calling Wirewall. And this system is measuring the speed and the volume of waves that go over the top of sea defences. And the reason we're trying to collect this data is to better plan new coastal schemes in the future. So there is limited funding. We need to build cost-effective schemes. We also need to work with nature going forwards. So we have sustainable approaches to coastal management. So to be able to design new schemes, we need to validate numerical tools. We need to understand what's happening now so we can prepare for the future. So this is just a few figures and facts. They're quite UK based because that's where I am, but coastal protection is obviously a global issue. So in England and Wales, there's about 32 kilometres of sea defences, and 20% of these could fail with about ½ a metre of sea level rise from today. So if we're thinking about future projections reaching a metre in the next 100 years, a lot of defences will need to be improved or changed and adapted going forwards. So in England, there's 520,000 properties that are in locations where there is some risk of flooding. And a lot of these properties are homes. So this is why it's important to plan for the future. And many of the sea defences in the UK were built in the 19th century. So they don't last forever. And they're starting to deteriorate while sea levels are rising. So if we're going to improve our defences, build for the future and set policies, we really need to understand what's happening now, and that's why we need new measurements. So this is just an idea of some of the costs. So I checked last week and a pound is about 130 in dollars. So if you have a very basic seawall, just a concrete frontage, it might cost £12,000 to £13,000 per linear metre. Now, seawalls could be anything from a few hundred metres to a couple of kilometres. So they suddenly become very expensive to install. They can be millions of pounds easily. But much higher quality schemes could be of the order of £23,000 to £24,000 per linear metre. But it's not just the seawall at the front of, between the land and the sea that we have. There's also everything behind it. So normally benches are put in, nice assets are put in, perhaps a crazy golf course. So there's a lot of reshaping a sea frontage to make it a nice amenity. So there's a lot of cost in protecting the coastline, but also making it a place where people enjoy the outside. So in the UK, since about 2015, £2 million a year, £200 million a year has been spent on capital projects to reduce coastal flooding and erosion risk. And this is why it's important to try and increase our ability to have cost-effective defences. So across the globe, people are trying to work with nature, which we've already heard in the first presentation, and that's to deliver more sustainable coastal schemes. So my photos here are from Australia. So I'm trying to collaborate with people in Australia where they're implementing mangroves in front of sea walls. So the little white arrow on the slide is showing a seawall behind a mangrove forest in Melbourne. But it doesn't have to be mangrove forests. It might be salt marshes that are being established. It might be oyster reefs. It might be mussel beds. And the idea is that if you have nature growing in front of a coastal defence, it acts like a big sponge, absorbing storm impact before it impacts us. And nature can grow with sea level rise. If it becomes damaged by a storm, it can recover afterwards. So it helps reduce the maintenance costs associated with concrete defences. And in some places, it will hopefully replace some of the hard engineered structures that we're putting in. Why do we actually need to observe overtopping and collect data? Well, the numerical tools that are used to estimate the overtopping volumes at the minute are at best within a factor of 3. And that results in 3 orders of magnitude uncertainty in safety thresholds when we design coastal defences. This means large safety margins are factored into the design of new schemes, which means there can be costly over-design of sea defences. So by collecting data, we hope to reduce the uncertainty in these numerical estimates to be able to have more cost-effective sea defences. And why do we need these overtopping estimates for soft engineering? Well, soft engineering, I guess, is quite new. And we don't totally understand how nature growing and then sustaining itself over time changes a flood hazard. So if a mangrove forest has become damaged, maybe there will be a temporary increase in flood hazard until it re-establishes itself. Over time, sea levels can rise, which means flooding will increase at a sea wall. But if a mangrove forest is also growing, it might counteract that influence. So we need to monitor the flood hazard over long timescales to understand how nature mediates flood hazard. And then using this data, we can create new tools to look at cost-benefit analysis to justify the benefits of greening the grey. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the system itself. So it's a capacitance wire system, and it's a prototype system, so there's not lots of them available. That's the first one that's been built that you saw in the movie. It uses capacitance wires, and we initially created it in the car park at the NOC. So in the photo, we've got 3 wires strung up, and we're throwing a bucket of water through it. As the water contacts each wire, it sends a signal, which is the graph. We process this graph so we know when each wire is hit, how much water hits it, and when it hits it. And from this, we can determine the speed of the water, and we can determine the volume of the water. And this allows us to measure the volume and velocity of individual waves as they pass over the crest of a sea wall. So, okay, creating systems in a car park isn't very sophisticated. So once we'd tested our electronics, we moved into HR Wallingford's Flume facility. So this is has a wave generator, and we have a scale model of our defence where we were going to deploy our instrument. So behind our seawall, we have a set of collection tanks, and then above the tanks, we have a set of wires. So we compare the data that we collect from the wires with the volumes of water collected in the tanks to give us confidence that our system really does work. The reason we don't use tanks in the field is because they have large surfaces, so a wave can hit that surface and send the tank itself flying. So by having an open-faced instrument, the waves can pass through it without causing risk of the instrument itself flying off and causing damage. So in the Flume, we could test storm impact, what would happen if the wires broke, and we could also test different wire thicknesses and look into different designs ready for using in the field. So again, this is just a little clip from the field, so you can see how we pass through our wire system. So they come up the seawall face and then they kind of splosh over. So this isn't really a very violent storm, it's just a windy spring tide, giving you an example that nuisance flooding is occurring more frequently on spring tides for ageing coastal defences. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of graphs just so you can see the type of data we're collecting for coastal managers. So this graph is the cumulative volume. The vertical black line is when high water occurs. All the coloured lines are the data collected from 6 wires at different spacings inland from the railings on the sea wall. So the red one is just in front of the railings, so that sees most of the water, and then the other ones are set further back. So before we get to the high water, we have large quantities of overtopping, and then after high water, it very quickly tails off. So we can tell the local council here that flood hazard is greatest on the incoming tide. By knowing the volume at different places across the promenade here, we could also inform people where it's safer to put buildings. So if you're thinking about designing ports and harbours, they do need buildings on the dockside. So we could say whether to position a building at perhaps a metre back from the seawall or further back than that. And then this is my last graph. These data, the green and the purple dots, are a time series of overtopping measured by the wire wall system at the hand railings. And the cyan line, this more symmetrical line, is a numerical tool used in coastal defence design. Again, the black line is showing when high water occurred. So we can see that on the rising tide, overtopping suddenly started. It's quite high, much higher than the numerical estimates. And then after low water, it very quickly drops off. So the under prediction of the model is about an order of magnitude on the flood tide. So the cumulative volume is going to be greatly under predicted. So we can use our data to calibrate this model so it can then be used to help design new scheme at this location. So a summary of what I'm up to is we're creating new tools that will hopefully help plan cost-effective coastal schemes where we need accurate tools and field data of wave overtopping. The new systems are now becoming available to measure site-specific wave overtopping hazard, and the system I've just shown measures both the volume and the speed of the waves as they crash over the top of a seawall. Using the capacitance wire approach is very low cost. It is just wires and scaffolding. So it means that if it does break during a severe storm, it's very easy to replace the components. We're now trying to add telemetry to this system to offer a nowcasting service, which would hopefully help understand defence performance during a storm, but also provide capability to offer alerts of flood events as they happen. So the data that we're collecting can be used to understand present-day hazards, calibrate numerical tools used in designs, and help people where coastal schemes are being planned. We're now going to have continued deployments to help us monitor any change in flood hazard due to perhaps natural processes or also human intervention. So now we've got a prototype system. By continuing deploying it, we can understand changes as they happen into the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was very interesting. Coming from the south coast of England, I know all too well the hazards there of coastal management. And at the moment, where I used to live anyway, there's a lot to be desired. So we actually had some questions submitted by participants before with the RSVP form, but if anyone else has anything else that's come to mind, just pop it in the chat. But I'll start with I will start with those. Oh. Sorry, it's telling me to return to the main session at the breakout room or close, but I don't think that's the case. I think we just have our own discussion within this breakout room as far as I was aware. So apologies.
Amy, this is Hannah, sorry. There's been a slight technical surprise. And so we're gonna pop back to the main room and then we're gonna pop right back here. And so please bear with us. This should be very, very quick.
Great, no, thanks for letting me know. Okay, I think that was the small technical glitch over and done with. So now we can get on to some questions. And thank you again, both Tiffany and Jenny, for your presentations. As Ronnie mentioned, this is actually just a quick question from me. As Ronnie mentioned, that Miami and Southampton are now sister cities. And I know both cities rely heavily on tourism and particularly their ports and cruise lines coming in. And I was wondering if there is a particular nature-based solution that you can incorporate into that type of economy to combat the kind of impacts of cruise lines and ports, or if it has to be kind of hard engineering solutions.
Not sure what the answer is there. I don't think it has to be hard engineered solutions. I'm not sure if Tiffany has an opinion on this.
So was the question was whether ports require hard infrastructure, or was it? I wasn't sure I completely. Sorry, I understood the question. Yeah.
So both cities have very large port infrastructure,
Yeah.
and I suppose it was a kind of two-part. The impact that that infrastructure has on the climate in that area, and then how are you able to integrate soft engineering into the kind of coastal management of port areas, or does it have to be hard engineering?
Mm-hmm.
If that's not an area that either of you are versed in, then we can move on to a different question.
Well, I mean, I would just say that, you know, you raise a really important point where in the context of environmental sustainability, when we're trying to build adaptation in our coastal environments, because people like to come to Miami because we have a beautiful water assets and you know, incredible natural systems that people expect to be able to enjoy when they come here on cruise ships. So you know, I think it just emphasizes the importance of cities that and larger you know, governments that generate a lot of their revenue from tourist and recreational taxes, as well as those sources for their economies. How even more important it is to consider how we transform our coastline so that we can also maintain the environmental assets that generate, you know, a large contribution of our economy locally and for our state at least.
Okay, thank you very much. It's also very relevant here even in Houston. Galveston is a very big port, and as you know, Houston is an enormous port, not for tourism, but for industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question in the chat from Dr. Donna Schaefer, who's a cybersecurity professor and interested in climate change. She asks, is there room for information security research related to issues like smart seawalls?
I guess that one's directed at me. So there must be room for that type of research as well, because as soon as you start collecting data, you have to handle it securely. And there's a lot of formatting issues, people using machine learning to use the data for other applications. So I'm not really a data specialist or so much into the informatics. I'm more interested in the sensor development, but yes, I'm sure that we need to work with people to look more into kind of the digital environment and how that data is used and communicated and shared.
Thank you very much. So this might be more to Tiffany, as you mentioned, kind of community outreach. But how, or if at all, are you kind of influencing policymakers to provide support for research in adaptation and resiliency solutions that have been suggested here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one example, you know, our codes, our building codes are universally applied at the state level, and then municipalities have the opportunity to increase, you know, their regulations over what the state provides. And so, you know, one example is, you know, having the opportunity to provide the latest scientific information in terms of, you know, what does sea level rise, what does you know, an increasing intensity of rainfall mean for designing buildings, as well as, including, you know, what elevation should our buildings be, and how do we manage this change in the context of codes. And you know, it's a process, you know, changing codes at the state level, but having the opportunity to provide that information and reporting and updated science is sort of the first step into getting that that information incorporated into state level codes. And so we have been able to make some progress in that regard. And then also, you know, locally, our county is really supportive of embracing research to help inform resilience, and I think we're lucky in that regard, and they're looking to us to help to provide the science-based, you know, the science basis for new policy interventions. And so having that dialogue and that open communication and support is, you know, sort of the first step in getting those into actual policy.
And the state is receptive with that, at the governor or legislative?
Yeah, it's a good question. There has been some movement and, you know, more appreciation for readying our state for climate change impacts. So the environment has improved, but we have a long way to go.
Thank you. And Jenny, within the UK, is that a similar kind of issue, or do you work well with the government in influencing any kind of policy, or is there any barriers there?
I'd say we work well with local authorities. So research normally partners with different groups when delivering projects. So probably we have quite a local focus. We work with our local authorities, we work with the Environment Agency. So there's a lot of sharing of information to influence policies. Shoreline management plans are what we're mainly looking at as we change from our present day epoch into the next epoch around 50 years and then look towards 100 years. A lot of these policies are evidence-based, so they do look to the research community for assessing baseline conditions, what's happening now, and computer models for projecting future plausible scenarios of changing coastal impacts to plan. So I'd say we do work well together.
Great, that's good to hear, reassuring. Okay, so another question that was submitted was how can we gain the interest and train students to learn more about adaptation to climate change, particularly during COVID-19? And are either of you aware of any tools that could be of use to do this?
As reluctant as I am to have another Zoom meeting, it seems to be working pretty well for maintaining communication with students and, you know, across disciplines. And in fact, I think there have been more opportunities. It seems that some avenues for communication have improved. For example, our city meetings now are online, and I think there's been a lot in our county meetings, you know, Board of County Commission meetings, for example, are all online now. And I get the sense that there's more participation as a result of that. I don't know what Jenny thinks.
Yeah, so I was going to say, what age students are we talking about? So during the initial lockdown in England, we did some writing poetry via Twitter, and we had schools involved because that came under arts and English. But the theme of the poetry was coastal hazards. So we used photos from research to show hazards and then had people writing 2 lines of poetry about different things when we asked some questions. And we ended up with community written poetry. So that's kind of school level student interaction. A lot of overseas research is also developing training courses, which are often delivered online. And those are being released through the education pages now on the NOC website. So I think there is now a move to more online training, which is becoming accessible to students.
Great, that's very helpful. I'm afraid I'm not sure of the kind of age range that the question was asked about, but that was, I think, covers everything. Online definitely has opened up and made the world a lot smaller, for good or for bad. More for good, I think. Okay, so next question. It's kind of along the policy side as well, but this is how can private organizations be better linked, do you think, to academia to help in a kind of support for policy settings on adaptation and mitigation? Do you both work with the with other private organizations in support?
I bet Jenny does a lot.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, a recent project, I'm now trying to work with National Rail, because a lot of rail lines are close to the sea in England, and then where there's wave overtopping, that disrupts the rail service. So I am partnering with National Rail at the minute. I'm trying to think of some other examples. We've also done projects looking at the energy infrastructure, and we've partnered with National Grid electricity suppliers, because a lot of substations could be in areas of flood risk, so they need to be protected. Different levels of substations are located in different places, sometimes in communities, sometimes outside of communities. So understanding the future hazard to ensure that electricity supply is always there. And that's another example where we work with people. So yeah, we do partner with government agencies, but also private sector companies. And we also work with consultants who are kind of planning, doing the work, doing the shoreline management planning, doing the designs for coastal defences for whichever industry has asked for one. We're providing data and trying to support the development of new tools that they use.
Yeah, I'll just add that, in terms of, providing some science advice. So, architecture firms, some that are trying to embrace embrace the concept of resilient adaptation in their own work, trying to partner with those types of private entities to help to bring more of those ideas into their own work. As well as trying to work with small engineering firms to implement research infrastructure, so that we have opportunities for understanding the influence of these kinds of demonstration projects that they're experimenting with municipalities that are open to that, and then also providing science advice to companies that are interested in trying to scale carbon dioxide removal opportunities. So a number of different ways. I think we're trying to partner a little more actively with private sector.
Thank you very much. Just on that last kind of point you made about carbon sequestration, with wetlands being a kind of carbon sink, is there a possibility they could be part of a kind of carbon credit system or carbon market, or is there too much kind of flux in those systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is, we need to have a more rigorous and widespread monitoring system in order to bring those types of ecosystems more actively into carbon markets. And as a near-term opportunity, you're thinking about the permanence or the potential for disruption of those stores of carbon. And there are ways in which that can be accounted for within carbon market systems. But I think probably the largest barrier is having the monitoring system so that we can verify the carbon that we're getting and the impact on the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you very much. I know I'm sure they're talking about this in the nature-based solution conversation. I know that's a section that Pete has a lot of expertise in. So just a question from one of my colleagues, in fact, how do you fit the best scientific solution to the particular requirements and limitations that local governments face when addressing sea level challenges? And are there any areas where compromises are needed?
Jenny, you want to start?
Yeah, that's quite a tricky one. So I would say we fit our science to funding calls, and normally they have a set amount of money, so we plan as much as we can deliver to meet that requirement of the call. So I'm not quite sure what the question was after there.
It was, are there areas where compromises are needed? Which
yeah.
So your research is based around what the funding is available for a specific kind of area, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would say climate, different hazards in the environment and managing the environment, different research calls go out and then academics bid into those research calls, and the best set of projects receive the funding.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't negotiation or compromise. We keep an eye on what opportunities there are for funding our research, and then the best projects from a peer review panel get the funding.
Okay. Does the science ever kind of lead where the funding is allocated?
So if we communicate our outputs and then the funders can see where there's knowledge gaps, then that might direct a future call, yes. But it also comes from perhaps the end users and the stakeholders. What do they need the science to do as well?
Okay. I have another question. This one's focused around COP26. So looking forward to COP26 and influencing the global conversation on climate adaptation, which is one of the key COP campaigns. What is a lesson from your work that you think is internationally applicable?
So I guess I don't have a lesson, but I'm hopefully going to deliver a new technology that could be applied internationally. So if we can plug a measurement gap, then hopefully we can better manage coastal hazards and plan, and then create more adaptive coastal solutions to flood hazard.
And Tiffany, do you have any globally applicable, maybe not all lessons, but research ideas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We don't have as many large mangrove areas in the United States, but we do have a lot of opportunities with recovering, creating, restoring coastal wetlands in around the world, and understanding how changes in sea level influence the capacity for us to incorporate those types of systems into global mitigation strategies is one area of work that is internationally relevant. And you know, I think also trying to discover ways in which we can better understand the the outcomes of our investments in resilience, and not just with the, in the context of, reducing flood risk, but what are the positive benefits that we are conferring as we're making these investments, and can we improve on our ability to do that as we learn from implementation and investments over time. And I imagine that this is done in different ways in different places, but trying to bring that those lessons learned and shared knowledge, I think, can help to advance that kind of an approach at an international level, which then sort of brings in more support for the types of strategies that are trying to be determined, negotiated, and approved by the global community. So, being able to share information, share practices, and share lessons, helps us to develop more of the consensus that we need to move things at a global level.
Thank you very much. So which policies do you think, either of you, in your opinion, should be a top priority in order to make a dramatic change for the ongoing climate crisis? It doesn't have to be, I suppose, adaptation resilience related. I think overall to kind of climate change, what do you think is going to be the most impactful or important? Both.
I'm sure it's a policy, but I think getting everybody to take responsibility is going to be the biggest challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, what was that?
I said it's not great. Perhaps it's not the most important policy. It's trying to get people to take responsibility.
Yes, right.
Challenge.
Yeah, right, right.
Because everybody has to play their role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say awareness and education is a big challenge, particularly in our current environment. I'm laughing. It's not funny.
Well, sometimes it is.
That's right.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Education for sure, and then taking responsibility. I will definitely agree, and I think that's one of our challenges here with the UK to help try and influence the US on that kind of very subject is educating, not so much educating, but engaging to encourage responsibility.
Right. We probably should say depoliticize as well.
Yes, that would be helpful. If that was possible.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a 2-minute warning. Well, yeah. Oh, with the 2-minute warning, I was just wondering, do either of you have any, with this conversation and those on the line, any last minute kind of thoughts or things you wanted to add, particularly important statements or questions for one another?
Well, Jenny, I'd love to have you come over and do some of your research.
I was going to say, could I have a whale in Miami? But I thought that's not what she's looking for.
Particularly since we're sister cities.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, I would like to thank you both very much for participating in this webinar. It was really interesting, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, being able to ask you questions, particularly having Southampton on the line, close to my hometown, and Miami is definitely somewhere I sadly have not had the pleasure of visiting, but would love to. It's definitely a priority area, and Florida a priority state of ours. So thank you both very much, and I think we can just let you go. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating very much.
Yeah.
Oh, not at all. It was an absolute pleasure. I was nervous, but it was great.
You did great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.